Why calm feels boring and why that is a problem. The question I couldn't shake. Last week, I wrote about boredom as a hidden obstacle to our growth. I mentioned my ongoing struggle with going to bed on time. Now, that may be something that's simple to most people, but for me, it is a real problem. And the thing is, I know that sleep is important. I know the research. I also know that I function better when I do it right. And yet, night after night, I continue to resist it. So after I wrote that piece, I kept on thinking about it. Why does going to sleep feel like surrender? Why does ending the day feel like loss? Why, after working all day, I suddenly feel entitled to stimulation? The surface explanation was easy. My family, they don't go to bed early. The house is still moving. The lights are on. Conversations are happening. There's life in the air. And if I go upstairs, I feel like I'm stepping out of something. But the explanation felt incomplete. So I started researching. And what I discovered was that this is not just a discipline problem. It's a nervous system problem. What the nervous system is actually doing. So the nervous system is the body's operating system. It is constantly scanning your environment and your internal state and asking one question. Am I safe, or do I need to act? It regulates your heart rate, your breathing, your digestion, your muscle tension, your alertness, and even the speed of your thoughts. And it has modes. One mode prepares you for action. The other one allows you to recover, repair, and restore. We work all day under pressure. We decide, we respond, we produce, we solve, we negotiate, and we perform. The problem is, when we finish working, we do not immediately enter recovery. We instead enter stimulation. We start to scroll, we stream, we text, we debate. The body remains activated, the mind remains engaged, and we call this relaxing. But physiologically, it is still activation. Then when it's time to sleep, the system must shift into recovery, but that shift feels abrupt. It feels flat. It feels like something is being taken away. And here is the deeper realization I begin to see. We have learned to associate activation with aliveness. We are busy, we feel important. If we are stimulated, we feel engaged. If something is happening, we feel relevant. When nothing is happening, we call it boring. But what is that association? Is that association right, or is it backwards? Calm is not the absence of power. It is power contained. A man who must be stimulated to feel alive is dependent. He needs noise, movement, reaction. A man who can sit in silence without reaching for his phone has control over his state. Think about the difference between someone who reacts immediately in an argument and someone who pauses, breathes, and answers slowly. Now, the first may feel intense, but the second one feels dangerous. It feels like they have competence. They know what's coming next. The intensity is visible, the control is quieter. But which one would you trust in a crisis? Again, consider sleep itself. When you stay up, watching something you enjoy, you are stimulated. It feels good in the moment. But the next morning, you're less sharp. Decisions take longer, small problems feel larger, your patience may shorten. You may not even be taking any notice of this, but when you sleep properly, something different happens. Your work compresses, you move faster, you think cleaner thoughts, false urgency fades. That's not boring, that's leverage. Activation is not just about work. As I was formulating my understanding of the nervous system, I realized that activation is not limited to work. It is about lifestyle. I began noticing how often I equate fun with intensity. A night out feels like energy, travel feels like expansion, a crowded room feels like being alive. Even certain conversations feel better when they carry a little edge. So I started asking myself, why does a quiet evening feel insufficient? Why does a slow walk in nature feel like something I need to justify? Why does staying home feel like missing out sometimes? If we're being honest, how many of us feel like life is not being lived unless something is happening? If the week was calm, then that means you need to create a movement. If there was no tension, then you need to find some. If nothing dramatic is unfolding in your day, you need to scroll or watch reality TV to find someone else's drama. For me, as I age, this is less and less the case. I like and enjoy my peace. That said, there is still something to the fact that we feel like unless these things are happening, we're not on an adventure. That is not an adventure, that is activation maintenance. Adventure expands you. Activation maintenance stabilizes a familiar inner state. They can look very similar on the surface. You're traveling, there's risk, there's energy, there's intensity, but the internal mechanics are very different. Adventure is chosen from stability, whereas activation maintenance is chosen from restlessness. When you are regulated and steady, adventure feels like exploration. You're adding something new to your life. You are learning. You're stretching your perspective. You return changed. I know I'm not the only one who feels stagnant if I'm, for example, not traveling to another country yet. I struggle to slow down enough to truly appreciate going to a museum or a long walk in nature or reading a book, because those experiences, they often feel flat to me compared to the constant stimulation that I'm experiencing on a daily basis. How we were trained into this. This need for constant stimulation that we all share begins very early in life. Maybe you grew up in a house where there was always noise. Maybe your parents argued a lot. Maybe tension was just normal way of life for you. Maybe you grew up in an urban environment where you were exposed to violence and unpredictability. The nervous system adapts to whatever is consistent. If chaos is consistent, chaos becomes the baseline. When you grow up in activation, calm does not feel neutral. It feels unfamiliar. And the nervous system interprets unfamiliar as unsafe. So you seek what feels normal. Drama then becomes comfortable. Intensity becomes identity. You do not do this consciously. It is simply what your nervous system has learned. Now, add modern life. Phones, notifications, streaming, news cycles, social media, constant access to novelty. Now we are not just activated by the circumstances, we're activated by design. But this is not universal. Different cultures and subcultures cultivate very different nervous system baselines. Some cultures normalize long, quiet meals that stretch for hours without phones on the table. Some normalize slow afternoons in museums to appreciate art. Some invest time in tending to gardens, shaping physical space with patience rather than urgency. Others build routines around early sleep, steady work blocks, and clear boundaries between effort and recovery. These practices are not accidental. They repeatedly signal to the nervous system that calm is safe. When downregulation is normal, focus becomes easier. In many of these environments, producing value takes precedence over performing excitement. There is less emphasis on partying as proof of aliveness, and more emphasis on steady contribution, skill building, and long-term progress. We need to strive as a people to get to this place. And that takes us calming our nervous system down long enough that we can appreciate and get familiar with calm. And yes, I know that many of us are in places and situations where getting that kind of calm is not necessarily possible. When you're in survival mode, this becomes difficult. But learn that if you're not in survival mode, that is the goal. The narrative addiction we don't notice. When it comes to sleep, there is another layer beneath all of this. The brain has something called the default mode network. It activates when you are not focused on a specific task. It runs your internal narrative. So, for example, it replays the conversations you've had. It imagines future scenarios. It simulates after future scenarios. It simulates victories. It re-argues your past conflicts. It plans your dominance. It fantasizes about success. Over time, we become attached to this narrative stream. The same mental loops, the same predictable thoughts, same imagined conversations. Television does not disrupt this pattern. It often continues it. You're not escaping your mind. You're stimulating it in a predictable way. The drama on the screen mirrors the drama in your head. The storyline outside keeps the storyline inside humming. Sleep, by contrast, shuts the narrative down. It interrupts the reward loop. It dissolves the ongoing story you're running in your head, and it does this for several hours at a time. And so no wonder it feels like loss. And so, as I mentioned last week, during the pandemic, psychologists began using this phrase called revenge bedtime procrastination. After a day filled with obligation, people stayed up late to reclaim their autonomy. It was the only time that felt fully theirs. Sleep became symbolic. Staying awake felt like control. When I read that, it hit me. After a day of performance, I wanted stimulation. I wanted the time to feel like mine. The problem was not that I loved television too much. No, the problem was that my nervous system had learned that activation equals ownership. The hidden tension inside discipline. And so, as in my article last week when I told you that the biggest obstacle to our growth was boredom, when you begin something new, you feel excited, right? Because it's new. It signals a shift in your identity or a future shift. Feel the momentum. You imagine your future version. There is this anticipation. Dopamine comes into it. But as repetition sets in, the novelty fades, the behavior becomes ordinary, and then the dopamine spikes diminish. And when the spikes diminish, the mind interprets that drop as boredom. Discipline, however, requires repetition, but repetition reduces novelty. When novelty fades, so does the excitement that came with it. And when that fades, most of us abandon the new self we were cultivating. That's unfortunate. The worst part, though, is that the tendency to see repetition as boring is not just internal. Disciplined people are often seen as boring because they remove visible volatility. No dramatic late nights, no chaotic swings, no constant reinvention. From the outside, it looks flat. And in a culture that equates movement with meaning, flat can look like failure. We admire intensity. We post the highlights. We tell the stories about chaos, reinvention, dramatic pivots, bold leaps. Even when we post about discipline, we understand that people are more interested in how the results look than the repetitive work it took to produce them. Escape-based relaxation versus regulation-based relaxation. As I explored what this meant for me and my goal of regulating my circadian rhythm, I realized I had to distinguish between two very different forms of relaxation. Escape-based relaxation feels like relief. Scrolling, streaming, drinking, staying up later than planned. It maintains stimulation in a different form. The nervous system remains activated even if just redirected. Regulation-based relaxation feels quieter. A walk without headphones, sitting upright, 5 minutes with no input, ending the day mid-thought, closing a book before exhaustion, letting silence exist without filling it. The first feels more satisfying in the moment, but the second feels boring at first. But over time, regulation-based relaxation changes what is your current baseline. Thoughts become cleaner, planning becomes strategic instead of reactive. You can see longer arcs. You do not need drama to feel alive. I also started sitting quietly at night for a few minutes without input. The first night, I felt restless. My body wanted something new, not pleasure exactly, just stimulation. But that restlessness was not boredom. It was unused energy. The power most people miss. We as a people, we've mistaken activation for vitality. We have mistaken drama for depth. We have mistaken stimulation for meaning. But the most powerful people in any room are rarely the most reactive. They are the ones who can generate intensity when needed and shut it off when it is not. The entrepreneur who can downregulate thinks more strategically. The leader who does not need constant feedback decides more cleanly. The man who can sit in silence without reaching for his phone can enter an argument without being hijacked by it. If boredom shows up when you remove stimulation, it may not be telling you that the habit is wrong. It may be telling you that your nervous system is recalibrating. What I hope is that if I stay calm long enough without escaping, then I may discover that calm is not necessarily boring. Instead, it is a power that does not need noise to prove itself. And that, for me, is far more dangerous than drama.